Hi, and welcome to The Existential Coach. This episode is titled Violence in Shadows. And in this episode, I want to parse some of the things I've heard when I've talked to individuals about violence in relationships and how it pertains to or how it affects people based upon their gender. So, for example, I've heard in talking to people about narcissism and dealing with narcissistic males, the quick defense of, there's narcissistic females as well. Similarly, I've heard arguments that a man who has hit a woman, they'll say, there's women who've hit men. I've also heard examples where people have said, the woman withheld, the children and all of these different things, wanting alimony, always wanting more money, not allowing the father to see the kids. And so this is just as unfair as any form of abuse, which is to say that, speaking to somebody or withholding from somebody, that is abuse. And so if a man hit a woman, then that's just another form of abuse within this whole kind of system of abuse. And so what happens is it really muddies the water. And this is the first point that I really want to drive home, is how in abusive relationships, perhaps one of the telltale signs is the way in which the abuse is rationalized, whether it's verbal abuse or physical abuse, sexual abuse. There's always some kind of reason for it. The person might say, I was abused as a child, or they might say, I didn't realize I was doing it. I had too much to drink, or I've been working really hard. They might say, I'm just, that kind of person, and I get carried away, and you like me normally, but it's not my fault. But all of these things are avoiding violence in the shadows, right, of violence that cast upon our lives in such a long, discursive way that we are led into this circular argument that is perhaps best described as a circular argument which is a nightmare. Because the answer to the violence is always some excuse. And it is never culpability, it is never responsibility. And so as I started off in this podcast, I said I wanted to parse out some of these ways in which we move to these excuses, to these reasons, to these rationalizations, and first say, why do we do that? Well, if we don't know what to do, if we feel lost, if we feel triggered, if we lash out in whatever way, then we've already conceded that we have no idea what to do. In other words, we've already said we do not know. And so to then say, we shouldn't have done that for these reasons, it doesn't really apply simply because we didn't know and weren't really thinking about another option. This was the option. And we know it was the only option because we start to make excuses about it, right? As opposed to saying, why did I do this thing that was hurtful, harmful? Why did I do it? We say, I had to have done it. So we accept that our actions were the only actions, and we are not looking outside of those parameters. So what does this mean? So if I imagine a situation and I'm talking to a woman who has left a violent relationship, and she's glad to be out of that relationship, she's worried about their ex and what that person will or will not do, and they feel always on edge. And they then have some doubt about that. They then think to themselves, maybe it'll be better, or people around me have said it'll probably work out. In other words, there's been this idea that things will just kind of go away, that it will just in some way vanish. And does that make sense? Does it make sense to assume that whatever the action is, whatever the violence that was experienced, that it would just stop. Now, there may be instances where it does. A person leaves his town or whatever the extenuating circumstances are. But that is not a reason in and of itself, right? Association is not causation. So there can be a chance that a person will do something in their lives that happens to benefit you in a way, i.e. they leave or whatever it is, or they die for that matter. But that's not really a plan, right? We're still in the mindset of I need to avoid, I need to hope, I need to wish, I need to some act of God almost will happen. And that becomes a trap in and of itself, because then we're rationalizing the fact that this experience, this violence, this interaction took place and is still taking place in our mind as we're thinking about it, as our body is reacting to it, hence the triggers. Yet we try and tell ourselves it's going to be fine, it's going to be okay, but we're still feeling like it's not going to be fine, it's not going to be okay. When people are telling us, well, you don't really have much choice, you have to do, for perhaps there's legal reasons or other cultural reasons that you need to, quote unquote, fall in line or go along with the status quo, whatever that is, yet you still don't feel it in your body. So this violence is being perpetuated again. In other words, the doubt that you are forced to really, well, it's not even doubt at this point so much as the lie you are forced to live with, which is you are feeling a certain way. You are feeling this in your body because of these experiences and because of other experiences, and they're not being acknowledged. In other words, the pathology of silence has created this shadow that casts into our lives that perpetuates the violence in all sorts of different ways. So it's not that one linear thing is happening. It's more that there is this kind of multi-dimensional, asymmetrical experience of violence that is occurring. Now, the reason why I bring this up is because in the beginning, if you recall this podcast, I was talking about the way in which violence becomes rationalized, right? So we say, well, he said, she said, basically. And as I was pointing out, all of that he said, she said stuff is just a way to avoid it's because of an inability to address the actual situation and move past it. So let's take a couple of examples. So one of the examples I gave was I would say, okay, well, I'm working with somebody. She's dealing with a narcissistic ex-man. And before I can go any further, I'm stopped. Well, women are narcissistic too. Is that what I was talking about? Is that what I was saying? Was I saying I'm working with a woman whose ex is narcissistic and women are narcissistic too? No, that wasn't what I was saying. And this is the fascinating part. And I want to really put a spotlight on this because this is the canary in the coal mine. This is a tell. This is a red flag. If I'm saying that a person I'm talking to is dealing with, a woman I'm talking to is dealing with a narcissistic male, and the first response is, remember, the first response is, well, women are narcissists too. We have just become complicit in the act of avoidance, which is to say we are substantiating the violence by diffusing it in a way to say, well, she may or may not have had these experiences. Other people may or may not have these experiences. It's not really an issue. It's not, we can't really point the finger here. We can't really address the problem. We can't really get under the hood. We can't really parse this argument apart. We can't really look at the individual and the experience that this individual is having. Instead, we flee to these generalizations. So another example would be, let's take a contrast. So on the one hand, we have a woman who was beaten by a man in a relationship. And on the other hand, we have a woman who wants her alimony increased and doesn't want the father to be able to see the children. Are these the same things? Well, when I've discussed them with people, they have presented them as being the same thing. Are they? Well, there's a couple of different levels we can look at this on. First is, does the experience of violence, of withholding, is that a hard experience? Yes. Is the experience of being abused a hard experience? Yes. Okay, so we can say these are both difficult experiences, right? Being somewhat minimal, and I'm not thinking about specific examples, but just being in a general way, we're saying, yes, these are both difficult examples. Does one negate the other? Because again, now we're looking at the red flag, right? Now we're looking at the canary in the coal mine. If I say a man was beaten by a woman, or a woman was beaten by a man, does that have the same effect? If I say a man is withholding his children from seeing the mother and wants his alimony increased, does that have the same effect as a woman saying, or me saying, that a woman wants her alimony increased and she is withholding visitation rights from the man? What I hope is becoming obvious is none of these are actually addressing the more fundamental questions, the fundamental existential questions of what's going on in these individual cases. So let's take the example that I'm using of the woman who doesn't want her ex to see the kids and wants the alimony increased, and the woman who's trying to get out of a relationship with a man, and he's narcissistic and he's controlling and he's abusive. Now, one thing to consider is within our society, what is the difference that I might experience? A sense of danger to myself. So the man who is unable to see his child for all these nefarious reasons, and the wife wants more alimony for whatever reasons, is he in danger? Is he physically triggered by this? In other words, does he worry about walking down the main street so he'll be seen? Does he get a security system to make sure that his ex doesn't come to his house and try and harm him? Does he do any number of things that one does when they fear for their physical well-being? That's an important distinction, and we'll come back to that. Then on the flip side, you've got the individual, and they actually want their children, let's say, to have a relationship with a father, but they don't want themselves to be drawn into this controlling, manipulative relationship with the ex. In other words, the woman wants to leave the relationship because she wants to, and that's all there is to it. And she does not want him to use the child as a way to control her, right? She wants to have agency, right? She wants to have choice. And so his need to control her, to manipulate her, is that the same, which is a form of abuse, of course, is that the same as a man saying, well, I'm not able to see my kids, and she always wants more alimony? I hope it's becoming clear that it's not the same thing, right? That if a woman is withholding and being narcissistic and doing all of these nefarious things, that she is operating within a kind of legal and political structure where she tries to gain power through whatever means she can, which is basically existing within our system, right? What we do is we do everything through a kind of legalistic or bureaucratic way of doing things. And it's unfair and it's unfortunate and it's all of these very negative things. But he's not in danger, right? His life is not in danger. He doesn't feel afraid to leave his window open when he goes to bed at night. He doesn't feel like he needs to have somebody stay with him when they go to court because she might become so triggered that she then goes to the house to assault him, right? So this is the distinction we're making, that the woman who is withholding custody from her ex and wanting more alimony is not the same as the man who terrorizes his wife in the name of custody, right? And if we're not able to make that distinction, if we go back to what I was saying before, if we still say, I'm talking to a woman, her ex is narcissistic, he's doing all these things that are deeply problematic, and I get cut off with the sentence, well, women are narcissistic too, then we as a community, as a society, lack the ability to understand what is actually going on in the situation because we are unable to actually name it. So you might be thinking, well, wait a second, what does any of this have to do with existentialism? Well, one of the key foundational principles of existentialism is that we are exploring our being by genuinely facing the paradox, the angst, the crisis of existence itself. And we do this in a number of ways. And one of these ways is to phenomenologically investigate, which means to explore the phenomenon of the experience in a hermeneutic manner. And we do this by really peeling the onion. You can imagine as this layer by layer by layer, we keep going. So if I'm presented with the counter argument of, as I mentioned a couple times thus far, if I'm presented with the counter argument of, well, women are narcissistic too, then I want to go to the next layer. I want to go and find out, well, why is that the response to the question of a woman who's in a narcissistic relationship? This is where you can say existentialism meets feminism and cultural relational studies, including any number of studies. But so the point here is we see that this question of gender, this question of the societal structure of who can or can't do what, this form of entitlement is all of a sudden interrupted. Now, how is it interrupted? If I said to you, I really like pizza, but I don't like anchovies, and you said to me, well, lots of people like pizza with anchovies, what does that actually mean? If I said to you, I loved spending time in Berlin, I was there 3 times and I loved it, and you said, well, lots of other people like lots of other cities besides Berlin. I mean, I think you're getting a sense of how absurd an argument it is, right? Here's another one. If I say, well, I love the winter. I love skiing and snowboarding and I don't actually do much in the winter, but let's pretend I did. I love all these wintry type of things. And they say, well, lots of people hate the winter. What is happening? What is fundamentally happening here? Fundamentally, what's happening is people are not hearing. They're not listening. And this is the existential phenomenological aspect that ties into this notion where we need to listen. If I say to somebody, I'm working with a woman who is dealing with an ex who is narcissistic, and I start to talk about that, and you feel nervous, anxious, uncomfortable, good. You should feel nervous, anxious, and uncomfortable because it is something to be nervous about, it is something to be anxious about, and it is something to be uncomfortable about. And we need to listen in a way that allows for us to feel this unsettling feeling, this sense of unfairness, this sense of unease, this maybe feeling in our gut, whatever it is, stress, this pain. We need to sit with that and not respond with one of these non-argument, straw man kind of arguments that has nothing to do with what I've said. If I'm working with an individual who's going through hell and you say, well, other people are going through hell too, that's basically a person saying, I'm speaking because I do not know how to listen. And that's directly a fundamental thing to existential phenomenology. That is, to really kind of layer by layer by layer. In a similar way here on this podcast, and all of the podcasts for that matter, all I'm doing is starting with something. Like today I started with this title, Violence and Shadows. And I've got this thing I'm thinking about, which is I'm thinking about different conversations I've had with women and the situations that they've had with these men, and how they have been at any number of levels been told that basically it's not, that guys have feelings too, and you shouldn't get too worked up about it, and don't call them a narcissist because that people don't like that. And I'm seeing all of this apologizing for what bothers me as a man, because I think the man needs to be responsible, or the woman needs to be responsible. But in this situation, if I'm an abusive man and my response is to not be responsible, that's a problem. And if society starts to apologize on my behalf to say, don't worry, you don't need to be responsible for your actions, that's a problem. If we can't name it, if we can't say, you know what, I told you about a hard situation that I'm going through, and the first thing you did was interrupt me by saying other people have hard situations too. That's a problem. Being gaslit is a problem, right? Being negated is a problem. Not being listened to. These are problems. And if we are unable to do that, then things will simply not change. So let's take a step back for a second. One of the things that has got me thinking about this is, as a man, I'm in a kind of unique position. How so? Well, the way in which I think about men and women is distinct from the responsibility that I have as a man, and others have to them in their relationships and so on and so forth. But fundamentally what this means is, I look at it and I think, these men and these systematic excuses don't make sense, and I do not ascribe to them. I do not support them. I do not believe them. So when the defense of a man is something like what I've said before, I think, well, this is deeply problematic for me as a man. So perhaps this part of the podcast is really about speaking to men and saying, when somebody is acting in your name, is that a problem? When somebody is saying, okay, here I am, I'm this guy, and I'm a good guy, and I'm doing all these things. And yeah, there's these other guys who are saying these kinds of things, but there are other guys. I'm different from that. And there's a system in place, society, that really protects these guys in a lot of ways. I say, yeah, but it has nothing to do with me. Well, that's another way around it, isn't it? That's another way of saying, okay, well, I'm a nice guy, other people aren't, so, but as long as I kind of keep my hands on the cart and do my thing, it's fine. I'm a nice guy, and that's all there is to it. Well, that's avoidance as well. That's avoidance of responsibility. That's avoidance of, in this sense, being a man, which is to say, that's avoidance of saying, hey, this is a problem, doesn't make sense. These arguments don't make sense. If I like pizza without anchovies and somebody likes it with anchovies, that's not a counter argument. So if we are unable as men to really see that, okay, if I'm an abusive man and I am looking for a way to excuse how I've been abusive, I want to find lawyers, I want to find anybody I can to tell me that it's not my fault. I am not being responsible. Now, this goes into this really interesting existential question that is raised by Sartre and others about the role that responsibility plays in freedom, in choice, in agency, in self-actualization, which is to say, we don't control our surroundings. So we don't control that we're born in, as men, that we're born into a system that has entitlements for men and so on and so forth. But we do have an opportunity to be individual by expressing and being a responsible agent, which is to say, if I can recognize that, okay, I'm given these things as a man. This is inauthentic, right? This is just It's just the way it is. It's just kind of the status quo. I haven't done any. Like, there's no achievement on my part. This isn't related to my ability. All that's really happened here is I was born in a time and place. When I see that something's wrong, if I use one of these kind of scapegoat arguments, well, other people are, they're bad, but I'm not bad. That is not taking responsibility. In other words, I was confronted with a conflict, and instead of facing it, I turn away. That's a problem, right? Because you are then abiding by a system that you didn't create, admittedly, but you are not defining, distinguishing, ennobling yourself, you could say, from. You are simply just going along with it. And this is where this pathology of abuse, we see it in these microaggressions, like the dismissal of, I say, I'm working with a woman, she has a narcissistic, and then get cut off. Well, women are narcissists too. That is an aggression. That is an inability to realize that I'm not talking about some other woman who's narcissistic. I'm not talking about some other woman who wants more alimony and isn't really nice about it and won't let the husband. I'm not talking about that. I'm literally in no way talking about that. I'm talking about this other situation that we've skipped out of. So what is it that leads us to want to skip out of these arguments? So as we come to the end of the podcast, the thing I want to sort of hone in and spend the next couple of minutes talking about is when and at what point do we skip away from these really difficult truths? When does violence become a shadow and we no longer see it as an actual physical effect of physical violence? Rather, we see it as being a shadow cast by something that's beyond our control. A shadow cast by a situation that we can't do anything about. A shadow cast by a perspective, an action, whatever it is, and we can't do anything about it, so we're going to make excuses. And we're going to make excuses in the same way that when we look at a shadow and we feel that shadow and it scares us, and we try and tell ourselves it's something else. But what we feel is actually fear. So how do we respond to that feeling of fear? So this has been a different kind of podcast, and I think it's been a little bit less linear than normal. I hope it's a more asymmetrical or poetic, or I hope you just listen to it and don't look for a specific point other than the idea of avoidance. And how do we start to move away from things that are uncomfortable? And when we're hearing about violence, we're hearing about structural violence, systematic violence, gender violence, race violence. When we're hearing about divorce, separation, how are we taking that in and holding that? What space are we creating? And it's really about this space. Can we hear that people are experiencing pain, that people are suffering, that people are struggling, people are triggered, people have experienced any number of horrors, and not try and bulldoze over it because we are experiencing this countertransference of them? Can we create the space to allow the violence in the shadow to be acknowledged for what it is a very real, painful, lived experience? So until next time, thanks a lot. You can find me at JordanO'Connor.com. All right. Bye for now.